sorry to be heavy on the whip, but I do want to honor the fact that Dr. Cadlick will be here. He's expecting to talk at 3:15. That gives us a little less than an hour for this group to edify us. And I'm looking for edification. It's been a good couple of days. We're going to close strong. I've got my favorite former state health director here. That's all of them. Unfortunately, she was an Air Force person. But I asked her, which golf course were you deployed to? But that's an Air Force, so what can I say? At any rate, Dr. Karen Remley, who is the former state health director for the state of Virginia, worked for Governor Kane, was the kind of pugnacious health director I love to see. She moved to the American Academy of Pediatrics and now is working with a foundation in a newly found self. So Dr. Remley and her team here will talk a little bit about response sort of improvements that we might take on. And Karen, take it away.
Great. So what I wanted to start off with, we've heard a lot about how to predict shortages during disasters and how to prevent them. Now it's really about how do we respond better when there is a shortage, whether the shortage already existed and was magnified by the disaster, or the shortage occurred because of the disaster. And then one other thing I'll say is, I think we talked in the last section about what if. The what if is really about who, because ultimately what everybody has been in this room for 2 days, sitting in these comfortable chairs inside, is it's the who. It's my children, your relatives, our neighbors, our colleagues, the people who live in our country or in other countries. It's those preventable deaths and disability that we want to be able to have an impact on, and that's why we're all here. And so we kind of want to bring it back to that, and in that method, what I'd like to start off with is Marianne, and I'll let you introduce yourself, but I'm going to give you a what if that becomes who very quickly, because this was one of my nightmares in the 4.5 years I was state health commissioner, was that there would be a toxic substance released in Northern Virginia and in the Washington area, for example, chlorine gas in all the subways, and that there would be hundreds of thousands of people who would be impacted very quickly at rush hour with the entire national press watching what was going on. And they'd all be coming to your ER. So, and all the other ERs in the area and overflowing very quickly. So how do you, in your role, think about shortages that occur quickly, and how have you looked at gaps and ways to improve those responses?
Okay.
And tell us who you are first.
My name is Marianne Amrashahi. I'm an emergency medicine physician, but I'm also a retired pharmacist who had an interest in drug safety, and that's kind of how I fell into medication shortages research. I practice here at Washington Hospital Center in Washington, D.C., and I'm also a medical toxicologist. So I really appreciate you asking me about a mass casualty event that involves a poison. And so this is something that we really think a lot about, particularly in disaster medicine. One of the unique things about disaster medicine, which is a subspecialty of emergency medicine, is their whole specialty is revolved around preparing for situations where we don't have enough of critical items. So in a lot of ways, I think EMS and disaster personnel are actually better prepared than a lot of us are to deal with some of these emergencies. Given the scenario that you mentioned, I can give you the example of nerve gas as opposed to chlorine, because there's an antidote for nerve gas. And this is actually something that's been impacted by shortages. There's a product called Duodote, which is a combination of pre-filled syringes that are injectable, that you can administer to patients who have been exposed to nerve gas. And one of the things that has been impacted by shortages is this particular product. So what do? So we try to stockpile what we have, but then what we started to do was get some of the individual components. And what we've been doing is we've been shifting the pre-filled syringes to the EMS and the first responders. And I know that sounds like a very trite thing, but if you've ever actually worn personal protective equipment in a disaster situation, I've only done so in drills, but it's actually very cumbersome. So if you think about, for example, having to draw up in a syringe 2 particular medications accurately and try to administer it to a seizing patient in the field when everything is kind of exploding into chaos all at once, that can be very difficult. So that's just an example of how things can be impacted by shortages in that particular scenario. In another scenario, I think this was maybe mentioned earlier, but looking at, for example, other medications that may be in shortage. So if a patient needs to be placed on a ventilator and they need medications to help get them intubated for rapid sequence intubation, we may be short on those as well. So the thing is really trying to stockpile what you can and have a backup and have a plan for when you don't have the products that you need and try to work on alternatives. Unfortunately, in a lot of these scenarios, the alternatives are also impacted. We talked earlier about shortages related to pain medication and morphine, for example. And I'd like to bring that up again because when we think about a mass casualty event, for example, where people are injured not just maybe by a nerve gas, but maybe an explosion where you have people with life and limb-threatening injuries, and your first medication you go to is morphine, and then you find that you're short on morphine. And then your next medication might be fentanyl or hydromorphone, both opioid analgesics. But those two happen to be out too because recently all three were impacted by medication shortages. So then you say, well, I have to get creative. Maybe I can give some ketamine, which is good for pain control. But then the ketamine, which is maybe your second or your third or fourth line drug, is also out. So maybe we'll say, well, hey, let's try a nerve block because sometimes that helps for patients with pain. And then you go to your emergency department and there's one vial of lidocaine, which is your most commonly used local anesthetic in the whole department. So it really does present a lot of challenges.
So one of the things you bring up, I think that was brought up yesterday, is the amount of time that emergency physician is thinking through all of these alternatives and exploring them is time where he or she could have been seeing another patient. And so for those preventable deaths and morbidity, the sooner you can have access to the most important medications and supplies, the sooner you can take care of that patient and move on to the next.
And then the other problem with the alternatives being out is just our own cognitive deficits. For example, if you are a physician like me, most of you are very comfortable with the medications that you use every day. But often, by the time you've gotten to the fourth or fifth line drug, you have to consult a reference, or your knowledge may be a little bit rusty, and you're more prone to make an error. The same way the nurse may not be as familiar with how to administer the medication because it's something that's used so infrequently.
Great, so we're going to bounce around because it's sort of, you're right there at the scene, right? And then there's local health departments, state health departments who work with their governors who then might turn to Greg and the Strategic National Stockpile to say we're overwhelmed. Or we're overwhelmed and don't have these certain supplies, we need them as soon as possible. How can we get them from you, Greg? What would you say are the successes and the gaps we still have in terms of the goals of the Strategic National Stockpile and how they're deployed?
I think that's a great topic of conversation. So first of all, I'm Greg Burrell. I'm the director of the Strategic National Stockpile currently at CDC. We'll be moving to ASPR on October the 1st. So when you think about the Strategic National Stockpile, the design was not to alleviate shortage. It was to be prepared for chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear threats. Slowly that has evolved to include some material for emerging infectious disease. And we've been called on over and over and over again, and we'll continue to do that, I think, and become more even integrated into response to natural events. Because there are places where we can serve as a bridge. There are some places where we have medications or devices that were intended for use for these CVRN type events that could also be useful in some of these other areas.
Explain CVRN to these people.
Chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear. I apologize. So I think that one of the things that is important here is establishing connections. And this sounds kind of minor, but it's incredibly important. And one of the things that we have been working on for some time is how do we connect both to an overall supply side of not just pharma but med-surg, and how do we connect to an overall demand side. So we've been working with, and I know Linda has mentioned this, with HIDA and a partnership to look at some of those commonly used items in a disaster event to understand better what we might be able to draw on from the market, where we might be able to buffer something until the market could be back in play again. One of the other things that we continue to look at, though, is that demand side. So we've been working with organizations that represent group purchasing organizations for hospital and healthcare, and talking to them about where do you see potential gaps? How can we better share information so that we get aware of something before it happens to us? A couple of things I could share about connections. I think beyond just those, we've spoken about the need for government ordering agencies to work together to try to overcome some gaps and challenges we have. Your chemical nerve agent example is great. I have learned more about chemical nerve agent antidotes than I ever thought I would know in a lifetime as we've tried to deal with some of these shortage issues. But I think one of the things that we were able to do there is bring together the government agencies that require that, one of those being ours to supply those to you in our chem packs. And we were able to work with DOD so that they could deal with a piece of the problem and we could deal with a piece of the problem to bring a foreign manufacturer into play to bring a piece of those duodotes to us, the atropine autoinjectors. And that was a help. So I think we learned from that cooperating across government can give us some opportunities in that area. I think that the other thing that we need to continue to think about, though, to make this better in a response is how can we watch something coming in, or how can we understand if something immediately impacts an area, what filled finished products might be impacted, but also what distribution systems and what raw materials might be impacted. Laura and I have had several conversations about this, and how can we identify critical infrastructure pieces that if we see, for example, the hurricane coming back into an area that's going to take out the only one of two manufacturing plants for something, can we help figure out how to move that product out before the hurricane hits? Or can we help, as Anita said, something about, providing generators? What can we do to keep that facility up and running so that we can keep moving? And what can we do in advance of that to look at, all right, if this goes down, we need to consider these foreign manufacturers, not when we have the shortage, but when we can predict there's potential for shortage several days out. So I think there are a number of things like that we must continue to work on. One of the objectives that we have over the next year is to bring together several of our individual partnerships, for example, with HIDA, HSCA, the Healthcare Supply Chain Association, and some others, to do an exercise overall to see where we sit in the case of some predictable events. What would happen? What do we need to be thinking about we haven't been?
That's fascinating, because I think back to the beginning of the SNS, and that was clearly response after event, and now it's how do we think about what events might occur and the impact they'll have on the overall critical infrastructure, not just that area. Do you see that going down to the state level, where you'd see state public health looking at more than just where's water and where's electricity, but what are all the other key manufacturers and how do they fit into the healthcare infrastructure?
I think that's an important point. We will always continue to work with our state and local and tribal and territorial partners around things that they see in their area that have a concern for them. Those areas that they probably know a lot more than we do about what's happening, who's manufacturing what are their challenges in distribution on a day-to-day basis, and how are those going to be impacted by disaster. So we've got to continue to work with the states and the locals, tribes, and territories as well.
You brought us right to one of the largest manufacturers and a wonderful corporate partner as we look at medical supplies and infrastructure. And Frank, I will let you introduce yourself and talk about how you look at this from the Johnson & Johnson perspective.
Sure. First, my name is Frank DeLucia, and I head up the CMC Regulatory Affairs organization within Janssen Pharmaceutica, which is the pharmaceutical wing or the pharmaceutical sector of Johnson & Johnson. And as part of my department's responsibility is we see our products coming in from discovery, we take them through the development cycle, through the filing and approval of the product, and then throughout its manufacturing life cycle within the supply chain. And as part of that responsibility, I sit on the senior leadership team for Janssen's supply chain, which would be manufacturing all of the drugs within Johnson & Johnson. And I want to talk a little bit about how the company responds to the disaster that happened in Puerto Rico due to Hurricane Maria. And I'm sure other big, large multinational companies would respond in similar fashion, but it's worth just taking you through what would transpire within a company, because we talk about shortages and how to prevent them. And just to take a moment, that when this disaster happened, right, we knew our facilities down in Puerto Rico, which we have 2 that manufacture pharmaceuticals, could withstand a Category 5 hurricane. So we were not concerned that the facility wouldn't make it through, but we were really concerned what would happen to the people. So our first priority was not to worry about the facility so much, but what happened to our people. You know, were there loss of life? Was there people losing their homes? Did they have any means to recover from this? That was our first priority, is to deal with the people and the people that were impacted at that site and in that country. We also knew at that point that communications with the site was going to be very limited. They had lost the entire electrical power grid. Their phones even were starting to then run out of battery power. So communications at the site was going to be very limited. So we immediately put in a central coordination group that was going to work across all of this at a different location where we would be able to maintain communication. Now, let me just point out something, because we talked about manufacturing. You're talking about, sometimes the examples were used was one individual product. We manufacture over 50 products in Puerto Rico, and not only supply them to the US, they are supplied around the world. And of those 50 products, there could be 5 or 6 different strengths of those products, ramping up the number of actual products that get manufactured there to well over 100 products. So one of the first things that we did once this hit was to do an assessment of, while the people were being addressed in Puerto Rico, we had another team looking at these products around the world. Where are they located in terms of supplies? How much supplies are available in each country? Because we supply well over 150 countries with these products as well. And how long would those supplies last within that country? And one of the most important things, we talk about transparency in terms of communication, is the accuracy of that picture. Because when we started to provide information to drug shortage, to different health authorities, we wanted to make sure we were going to give them accurate information. So we had to pull all of that for, again, well over 100 products in well over 150 countries, their supply picture, how long it would last. We referred to it as the burn rate, how fast the product was going to be used up, and where we were going to see incidences of shortages that would occur in any country around the world. And then the next step would be, can we start looking at diverting supplies? If we knew we had in some distribution centers excess capacity, could we divert that to maybe centers that were going to experience something that would make them use their product a little bit sooner? So that was one of the first things that happened. Then when we started to get in communication with the people that are at the sites, we quickly realized that and to the credit of the people in Puerto Rico, they came back to the site very quickly to, again, start manufacturing. So within 2 weeks, we had an assessment of what is our capability of coming back, what are the complete damages, and how fast would we be able to ramp up production back to where it needed to be. Now, we could sustain the plant on generators, but what we didn't have is access to raw materials that we needed to come into the site in order to produce the products that we needed to produce. So we had to do a complete assessment on that, and then we started to ramp up production again. And frankly, we were at 50% capacity and then 75% capacity and upwards. The next thing that we took is to say, okay, all of these products, where else are they manufactured in our distribution chain? And how fast can we start supplying products from those alternate sites? Because remember, again, we would have to get all the raw materials there for them to ramp up production to be able to supply this global market. So all of these things were happening simultaneously. And the other thing that we were looking at is once we had the complete supply picture, we knew the risks. We knew that we would have to get certain products to certain countries within a certain period of time. So we knew that, and we knew where those countries were. We communicated that to the health authorities. We communicated not only to FDA, but trust me, EMA in Europe, they're equally as interested with where we are with these supplies and things of that nature. And then we were able to say, okay, knowing this complete picture now, here's what we need to manufacture and ramp up quickly in Puerto Rico, what products were vulnerable, what products we could supply from our alternate manufacturing facilities and how fast we can get them there to ensure that no patient anywhere in the world missed even a single dose of one of these products. That's the commitment that was being made. And then once we had that picture and we had all of that taken place, we then set upon to say, okay, we're going to update regulatory agencies every 2 weeks. So we would update FDA drug shortage every 2 weeks, we would update EMA every 2 weeks, and every agency knew where we would stand on any particular time. And as we came up to 50% to 100% capacity, we informed that as well. Now, one of the big things that you need to really take care of here is the accuracy of communications and where it's going. We were contacted by 3 different groups at FDA, all within a matter of days, to understand where we were. One, FDA drug shortage. 2 days after the event, we were already on the phone with them. Secondly, you have the district offices, in this case in Puerto Rico, wanting to have information. And then FDA also had something called a Hurricane Incident Management Group. Also were asking for information on where we are with the plant and things of that nature. Now you take that and you say, okay, there's a similar situation in Europe with those communications and elsewhere around the world. So you had to make sure, and one of the most important things is to have a central group coordinating the communications so that you had a complete accurate picture to every agency that needed to know where you stood with the plan. And this was done, as I said, until we recovered to the point where we could say for 100% certainty we are no longer at risk for any shortage in any country. And we are back to full capacity within Puerto Rico, as an example. So that's the kind of commitment that companies put forward. I'm sure we're not the only one that has done something like that. Other companies as well. I think we heard some GSK thoughts on this as well. But that's the response that, frankly, I think is expected of companies, and some of the things that we do as an organization to respond to a natural disaster that could produce shortages of critical drugs.
Thank you. So, returning to Lauren, so now we'll go back to, this was a man-made disaster, of course, and it impacts millions of people in the Northern Virginia, Maryland, because of course everybody's going in other different directions, and DC. All of the health systems are talking to each other. The state health directors are talking to each other from 3 different jurisdictions. They're talking to the Strategic National Stockpile and trying to get in supplies and people. The 2 governors and the mayor have all declared a public health emergency. We know that those shortages that already existed have been significantly exacerbated because we have so many critically ill people. We know that there are shortages in drugs and supplies that nobody even thought were going to happen. What is the role of the federal government and ASPR now? Also knowing that within the larger United States, people are scared and panicked and are worried, if this happened here, can it happen in Kansas City tomorrow, and will you have the supplies if you sent them all to Washington?
Sure. So I'm Laura Wolf. I direct the Critical Infrastructure Protection Division for ASPR. Our broad charge is to enhance the security and resilience of the healthcare and public health system. So not a small mandate there. So we have 3 critical functions to get to what you're asking. First of all, we analyze and manage risks to the healthcare system, which is a huge component of what we do. The healthcare system is mostly owned by the private sector, so in order to have any impact on risk mitigation, we have to function through a partnership. So we have our critical infrastructure protection advisory councils, government and private sector councils that work together to solve these problems, to come together and plan. So part of our work is managing that network of partners. During a response, we activate those partners to talk about what's happening in the response and where the challenges are. And where we're beneficial in that is that we try to represent the full spectrum of healthcare and public health. So we have direct patient care partners, both associations, large organizations, small organizations, across all of hands-on patient care. The plans and payers, pharmacies, laboratories, blood, the supply chain is represented, health IT, and mass fatality management, all on the private sector side. And on the government side, we bring together our federal partners. Like all of the federal partners you've seen today are on my speed dial, I have to say, during responses. So our federal program offices, but also our state, local, tribal, territorial partners through the Governors Association, through public health associations. So what our main function becomes in a disaster is providing insights-driven decision-making for both government and for private sector. So I sit in the Secretary's Operations Center on behalf of VSF VIII, bringing in the private sector perspective, both what data is out there about what's open and closed and having problems, but also anecdotal perspectives from our conversations with our private sector partners. But that's to inform our government leadership. We work very closely with FEMA, with DHS, that has private sector security advisors in the field, all gathering data and trying to be helpful. But I also found through the hurricanes and through shortages, a big role of ours is to help with decision making on the private sector side. There's a lot of information out there. It's moving through a lot of channels, but there's a lot of translation that I find is sometimes necessary. So, for example, with the saline shortages, we've seen saline shortages in past years. We know they're not quickly resolving. But that lesson has not necessarily been learned across the board. And so so we have ASPR regional emergency coordinators, RECs, across the country. And soon after the saline issues started this year, they had their private sector partners asking them questions and had lots of conversations with me where they would ask, well, do you think this will be a couple of weeks? And I would say I have no concrete information, but based on history, my opinion is this could be a long-term event, and you may need to plan for that. And jaws dropped, and it was sort of that honest transparency and that translation of what a report from the drug shortage program really practically means. I'll give another example of our response efforts in Puerto Rico. Because the grid was down for so long, there were difficulties producing medical oxygen and other gases required for healthcare and also for manufacturing on the island. The challenge there was you couldn't start production on a generator. They had the Army Corps of Engineers out there figuring out, if we had the huge generators that power military bases in Afghanistan, could we get this started? And the answer was probably not. So we had to wait for grid power to get back on. Obviously, this is beyond the scope of a business continuity plan for most organizations, thinking about a very long-term complete grid power outage. So we facilitated a government group to work with those manufacturers to think about how to get oxygen shipped to the island. But we were never sure that what we were going to be able to bring in would meet all the needs of all the partners on the island. So we worked very closely with Puerto Rico's Department of Public Health to think through, or Department of Health, to think through how we prioritize this. And it absolutely became a scarce resource discussion, an ethical discussion. In the end, we prioritized acute care, home care distributors, and then manufacturing that required that oxygen. But that was also an important piece that we were able to communicate through our partners, through trade associations, to say, listen, I don't know if there's going to be oxygen produced on the island or brought to that island that you will be able to receive. So I told the manufacturing community if they had the capacity to bring some in themselves, that would probably be necessary in the longer term. And I know there were some success stories with that in the long run. So just that transparency of not necessarily sharing proprietary data, but being as honest as we can based on past experiences has been really helpful. So in your situation where it's a total disaster in Northern Virginia, we'd have our ear to the ground and be listening on all sides for what information might not be clearly conveyed through data, and how can we shape the response and decision-making on both sides to be most effective.
You know,
Yes, sir.
let me tag on that for 1 second. I think that you make a great point about the need for transparency and the concerns people have about sharing proprietary data. And I also understand some of the antitrust issues involved in some of that. And one of the questions we've asked a couple of times as we started to look at something that was beginning to evolve is there or can there be some trusted agent that understands that full picture of data, that protects that in an appropriate way, but so that we don't create an intervention that is going to have more problems resulting from it than resolving anything.
So what I hear from all of you is, I think about it, and then I think of Mary Ann is the person who's actually going to save lives. And the first responders and the people who are in the hospital are really going to be the people who are able to prevent preventable deaths. You all enable her to be able to do that by making sure she has the right supplies at the right time, and if she doesn't, she knows what she will have and what she won't have, and that you have her back and are working behind her to make that happen. And I think sometimes we all forget that, because that really is the ultimate picture of whether it's, Puerto Rico was a disaster that rolled out over a period of days, weeks, and months, or we talked about H1N1 earlier, which was 6 months. But then there are also those disasters that are, 9/11, which was very fast and very unexpected, that had significant impact on our country, both short and long term. I'm not going to ask any more questions because I know we're a little short on time, and wanted to open it up to the room to see if anybody had anything for this group. And I am not surprised that we have our EMS leader from Colorado. I was expecting you to walk up.
Yeah, I'm glad. I appreciate the opportunity. And I wanted to take the opportunity to respectfully remind everyone in the room that the response doesn't start at the emergency department doors. And in fact, when we're talking about chem packs and mobilizing chem packs and stuff, it's our people that are going to be the ones administering those agents. And so there are some significant gaps, I think, as we're talking about end-to-end evaluation of these systems and predicting not only demand for medical supplies and pharmaceuticals. I think there's a big blind spot that the response community represents. And the blind spot is we don't really have a great node of policy entry in the federal government for EMS. We kind of have a foot in the healthcare realm, and we have a foot in the public safety realm. And so where we end up often is, if you look in federal doctrine, we're part of the emergency services sector under DHS with a sector-specific agent, which is DHS. We're not really part of the healthcare infrastructure under HHS, so we really don't have a place to go for that kind of policy level support or viewpoint. So as an example, I think when we start talking about the predicting demand for these things, not only are we missing out on what are the prospective demands of EMS agencies in terms of PPE and things like that from a response, but as part of the response community, I can say that if we have an infectious disease, for example, if we're using the patient encounter as a surrogate for demand, we may have 10 people wearing PPE on a single patient response that are not going to be reflected in the demand analysis because it's one patient encounter. So we have four or five firefighters, 2 or 3 police officers, 2 paramedics on that call. And so you may end up having multiple people that are using PPE. And I think as especially in a protracted event, you're going to see that demand continue to go way up, and it might be a blind spot for the producers that are trying to predict manufacturing demand, et cetera. And then the last thing I would say is, I think we need to think about the public in the recent examples of like Las Vegas. There's a self-organized response by the public, and I would envision something similar happening if people start dying from infectious disease. And so we need to kind of think about that demand that may come from those types of self-organized responses that we haven't really discussed much about in here the last couple days.
Two excellent points, and one that I'm turning to you all, because in Virginia, EMS is under the Department of Health. But in other states, it can be under the Department of Public Safety, it can be the Department of Fire, and so just even getting people together nationally, they come up through different cultures and different ways of looking at issues, and it is a real problem. And so I don't know, that's where on a national level, being the convener and thinking about how most firefighters have moved from much less fighters, but much more first response to medical and health emergencies, and what that looks like, I think is really important. I don't know if any of you have.
So our ASPR leadership now, as Dr. Yeski and Dr. Kadlik, have recognized that EMS is a critical component of the response. So when you see our plans for moving forward on either regional disaster health response systems or even with critical infrastructure, they've asked us to incorporate EMS. So I'm happy to say I thoroughly promise as we rewrite the sector-specific plan in 2019 to incorporate EMS. I think it's similar to how pharmaceuticals are both chemical and health. EMS is certainly emergency services and health, so happy to do that as well. And I'll flag another gap we have is academia and the research community, and I hope to incorporate that as well this year. But very important points. And for the public, I think we did try to think of the Cajun Navy in Hurricane Harvey and thinking about how to get those perspectives and that source of information as well on our partnership. We haven't figured out how to do that except for organizations that present themselves, but we're thinking about that.
It sort of also sounds like thinking about good human behavior in the midst of disasters. What would people do where they self-identify and get involved in the response effort, and how do you encourage that or promote that would be interesting.
And I want to say too, to your example, every infrastructure we engaged with on the island of Puerto Rico, whether they were calling us for support for fuel or things like that, they all talked about their people and how the people showed up. If manufacturing was happening, it's because the people believed in it. When dialysis was happening and when they knew how many dialysis patients had care on that island, it was because of the dedication of those workers. And so I think we have to consider that workforce. I say it's part of critical infrastructure, but we really have to look to that as a key component that we rely on.
If I can just finish with Amy Kircher's question about if you had whatever, it would be more, I'm asking for more than 10 million. But if I could have anything, it would be the designation of a lead federal agency for EMS at the federal level with responsibility, authority, and funding to meet the mission.
Yep. Include EMS for children in that too.
Amen, sister.
Hi, Michael Gagno with the American Society of Health System Pharmacists, and I'm going to call on Frank if you don't mind. You described what you might consider best practices on being prepared for a disaster or even for shortages in general, something that you said responsible manufacturers should be looking into, and we heard from another representative from the pharmaceutical industry, I believe it was Glaxo earlier. What would it take, what barriers would we need to overcome to implement those practices as requirements? How do we overcome those barriers? How do we get the industry as a whole to buy into the need for that and put those into regulations?
I think it's important for manufacturers to do what I consider scenario planning. We've already done this type of planning if our plants in Puerto Rico had gone down. That was part of we already planned the scenarios around that, or we could say we have a plant in Italy. It's could have an earthquake there. What happens if that plant goes down? What would we do? So if you scenario plan, you start to come up with strategies like, for these products, we're definitely going to have multiple manufacturing sites in place. For these products where we may not need that, we're going to take a stockpiling approach and make sure that we have adequate supplies available that could last 6 to 9 months or even longer. So those are the kind of scenarios that you have to plan well in advance. And maybe companies think that, okay, well, that'll never happen. Well, sometimes it will. And if you're not ready for it and at least have a plan of action that you can take, you're going to get caught by it. Now, you say, well, why doesn't other companies do it? It takes a lot of resources. It also takes a lot of dollars to do that as well, because you're spending a lot of time and effort planning for something that you're hoping never occurs. So that's some of the
You just described my life.
Yep.
And if I could add to that, I think one of the successes we've had in working with HIDA particularly, and that we want to try to expand on, is we've brought in a lot of their members to ask a what-if question and go through a tabletop sort of discussion and exercise about what if this happened, what would you do?
I think everybody knows what HIDA is.
So HIDA is the, I'm going to get it wrong.
Healthcare
Industry Distributors Association.
Thank you.
Did I do it right? Thank you. So we were able to bring them in and look at one specific response scenario and say, if this happened, what would you do? And it generated, I think, a lot of interesting conversation between people who are normally competitors. And I think one of the things HIDA has come back and talked to us about is how useful that has been to them and how useful that's been to their members. So we hope to expand on that. And I think that might lead to more of that kind of scenario planning that people had not thought about in the past.
And the one thing I want to point out, stockpiling, because I heard that a lot. That may work very well for solid oral dosage forms, but when you start to talk about biologics and compounds like that, it doesn't work so well because the shelf lives are not as robust where you can say, okay, we'll stockpile it for a year. Well, you may in some cases be already reaching your expiration date. So what I would say is that you have to take it on a case-by-case basis as well.
Good afternoon. I'm Monique Manasura with the MITRE Corporation. Frank, I just want to follow up and ask, you've really eloquently articulated that this, what we've heard earlier in the meeting, this contrast between either you're responsible to your shareholders or you're investing in preparedness, you're spending money to prepare, that it's an and, not an or, right? So the resilience, the hardening that you've demonstrated that Janssen is built into through scenario planning. So part of it is what scenarios, the challenge that I had in my alter ego as the CEO of Needles RS yesterday and the whole panel was this idea when you have ambiguous sort of 3 days of supplies or 4 days of supplies, like what does that mean? So can you talk a little bit more sort of the range of scenarios and how you think with specifics? I know we're talking a lot about hurricanes and floods, but we talked earlier about counterfeit risk, geopolitical risk. We haven't talked that much about cybersecurity, but we've seen enormous impact on the biopharmaceutical industry and hospitals due to cyber attacks. Again, there's a broad range of risks. How can we be more specific about what preparedness is against what range of threats, and what tools and levers and incentives both the private sector and then I guess for Greg and Laura, the public sector have to bring in advance of these catastrophes and disasters an enhanced level of resilience and preparedness?
It's an interesting question because it's not only Janssen, but it's all Johnson & Johnson that prepares for this. And the way basically what we tend to do is to look at least from my perspective, because again, I'm in manufacturing, is we look at being without a facility, a plant, maybe has gone down, and you can't get it back up in any reasonable amount of time. How would you be able to then react to that? And what are those products that would be impacted? And then how would you either alternate manufacturing sites, stockpiling, things of that nature. Now, there's many other things that get planned out, and some are political. As an example, the situation that's occurring in Venezuela right now, where we can't even get our products into that country to be able to provide to patients and things of that nature. That's another type of scenario that's not really done by ours in manufacturing at this point. That's more done at a corporate or a different level. that they would start planning for those type of situations. But it does take a lot of effort to look at that and strategically start looking at where your vulnerabilities are, because that's really what the scenario planning is where your vulnerabilities are and what you can do about it to mitigate it if whatever event occurs. And sometimes it's also our suppliers, because even though we're not impacted, we do have raw materials that are coming in, and we look at the vulnerability of them as well and say, okay, for this material, we need multiple sources of where we can get it, because we're not as confident in maybe that supplier in their business continuity plans. So that's part of it as well.
J&J, are these like quantitative assessments? Do you say it would cost X amount to provide Y amount of protection against Z risk? Or is it quantitative, or is it?
Generally, we don't speak, at least in Janssen and our supply chain, we don't talk about dollars. We talk about how do we make it happen and where would we be able to do this. And yes, there is a factor, because you're not going to say, okay, we're going to have to build a whole new manufacturing facility at the cost of $800 million. Is there another way we can do it? Can we partner with a contractor and have them be able to take some of this so that we have multiple sites that way? So it does come into play, but I would say that's the secondary factor. It's first, what are we going to do and how can we do it?
Right. So I think the interesting thing for me is we've talked about convening, collaborating, relationships, knowing people ahead of time. I think the average life expectancy for a state health official is 2.5 years right now. So the first time you meet Greg could be the last time you meet Greg or Laura, or you may be meeting them at 2 o'clock in the morning on a phone call to start off with. And now we've said we need to bring more partners into the conversation. So I think that's so important. And to me, it speaks to the need for leadership and positive leadership, because I think back many years ago where hospital systems competed and they would not tell you how many beds they had left in their ICU, or because everybody wanted, it was business as usual, and we're not going to share that information. Now during critical times, they will share that information, share it openly, but it takes leaders who want to lead through that change and be able to move them to that level. So I'm encouraged to hear you talk about HIDA and the work you're making there. Any last thoughts? I know I saw Greg keeps walking in and out with his pacing back and forth, and I think that the Assistant Secretary may be here, so we're probably coming close to an end. But any additional thoughts? Miriam, we'll start with you.
I think one of the things that I'd just like to touch on in this is that we are dealing in a disaster situation with real people. And so one of the things I wanted to close with is just having an ethical framework for at the bedside when you have to distribute limited resources. And remember that you're caring for people.
I'm going to do a shameless plug of a couple of our products in response to Monique's question and an event coming up in October. So you can't adequately plan for disaster if you don't have a good understanding of your risk. And there's a lot of subjective risk assessment going on in the healthcare system broadly. So we've worked with our partners over the last 3 years to develop a risk assessment tool. We're about to release it before the end of this fiscal year. So if you're interested in that, and the next thing I'll say, you can email us at cip@hhs.gov for more information on the risk tool. And we're bringing together our government and private sector partners October 10th and 11th. The main activity of this partnership meeting will be a discussion of a scenario surrounding flu, celebrating 100 years since the pandemic, with a cybersecurity inject. And I know supply chain will be an important component of that discussion. So if you're interested in joining us and the councils, again, cip@hhs.gov.
That wasn't shameless, that was good.
That was great. So,
No shame.
absolutely not. So I think that, the continued collaboration and the work that we've been doing, and how do we expand on that? I think to try to identify more risk, to identify ways to combat that risk so that we're prepared to do what we have to in a bad event. There is no way that we can do this without partnering across the entire spectrum of healthcare. This is not, the government is not the solution. Craig Vanderwagen told me years ago we can't stockpile our way out of things, and I agree with that. And it's how do we all work together to make sure that we can take care of what we have to with what we have.
Right?
Yeah, I think the way I would And it is basically, we heard a lot of discussion, and I think between the government, between healthcare providers and workers, and I will even say industry, we all are concerned about our patients and making sure our patients get the products that they need. I think we can all partner together on this, and not one versus the other, but all partner together for the benefit of patients globally, around the world, because it's also not also about the United States as well. Products are produced worldwide, and patients worldwide are relying on them.
Excellent. So we're ending on talking about the benefit of all people and the health and well-being of all, and I can't think of a better way to stop and have you all welcome this panel. Thank you.